The Western Allies, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, anticipated a swift collapse of Axis Italy with their invasion of Sicily in the spring of 1943. Instead, they slammed into a brutal German fortress commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Like relentless waves against an immovable rock, the Allies shattered against the impenetrable Gustav Line, defended tenaciously by General Heinrich von Vietinghoff's troops. Months of futile assaults left the Allies desperate for a breakthrough. A daring plan emerged, a massive amphibious landing north of the Gustav Line at Anzio, to outflank the Germans, strike from the rear and spearhead a march on Rome in a single decisive blow. On January 22, 1944, an armada of 374 landing craft, destroyers and warships, supported by over 2,200 aircraft and more than 150,000 men, launched an audacious assault. The operation, commanded by Major General John P. Lucas, aimed to pierce the soft underbelly of the Axis powers once and for all. The Allies landed like a thunderbolt, catching the Germans off guard and encountering minimal resistance. Victory seemed within grasp. But Kesselring had anticipated the enemy's move. As the Allies prepared for an unchallenged advance toward Rome, the Wehrmacht orchestrated one of the most devastating counterattacks of the war. The road to Rome would be paved with blood and fire, and the Allies would pay a terrible price for their ambition. The Mediterranean theater of World War II was about to reach its boiling point. As the spring of 1943 dawned, the Allies, led by the indomitable General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had just wrested control of North Africa from Axis hands. But this was merely the opening act of a grand and terrible drama. With the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, the Allied forces carved their way through Sicily. Under the command of General Bernard Montgomery and the audacious General George S. Patton, the island fell in less than a month. The Mediterranean, once an Axis stronghold, now lay open before them. The Germans could only watch as their influence in the region crumbled like sand through their fingers. Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, now lay exposed and vulnerable, cut off from vital supplies. The fascist regime that had stood for 2 decades began to teeter on the brink of collapse. Benito Mussolini's iron grip on power finally shattered in a history-defining moment. On September 3, 1943, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, representing what remained of the Italian military, put pen to paper and signed an armistice with the Allies. The news reached Adolf Hitler like a thunderbolt, igniting a firestorm of fury. In a desperate gambit, he immediately dispatched several divisions under Kesselring's command to seize control of Italy and disarm its forces. Meanwhile, the Allied forces, now under the leadership of General Harold Alexander and General Mark W. Clark, began their inexorable march northward through the Italian peninsula. Hitler feared the consequences of losing Italy, envisioning enemy bombers taking off from northern Italian airfields to rain destruction on German soil. He could not allow it. He would make Italy the anvil upon which the Allied hammer would shatter. At significant cost to his forces on the Eastern Front, Hitler poured reinforcements into Italy. A series of daunting defenses, collectively known as the Winter Line, began to materialize. At its core lay the Gustav Line, a nearly impregnable fortress, leveraging both the mountainous terrain and the Wehrmacht's military hardware into an imposing barrier stretching across Italy's waste. Here, under the command of General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, the German forces prepared to make their stand. For 5 long, bloody months, the Gustav Line became a meat grinder for Allied forces. The road to Rome, so tantalizingly close, remained frustratingly out of reach. In this moment of desperation, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill proposed a daring gambit. As it would come to be known, Operation Shingle called for a massive amphibious landing in northern Italy. This bold move would force the Germans to split their forces, potentially creating the opening the Allies so desperately needed to break through the Gustav Line. As Major General John P. Lucas prepared to lead this high-stakes gamble, the fate of the Italian campaign, and perhaps the war itself, hung in the balance. As the bitter winter of 1944 gripped Italy, the Allies were poised to unleash a daring gambit that would shake the very foundations of the German defensive line. Operation Shingle, A bold thrust into the heart of enemy territory was about to begin. The target, Anzio, a sleepy coastal town just 35 miles from Rome. But this was no mere resort. It was the key to unraveling the seemingly impenetrable Gustav Line, the German fortress that had thwarted Allied advances for months. The plan hinged on a desperate gamble as the US Fifth Army hurled itself against the Gustav Line. A strike force slipped behind enemy lines at Anzio. It was a high-stakes game of distraction and deception, with Rome as the ultimate prize. General Mark W. Clark, the architect of this audacious plan, handpicked Major General John P. Lucas to lead the charge. Lucas's orders were clear, drawing the enemy's gaze away from the Gustav Line and driving towards the Alban Hills. If fortune favored the bold, they might even link up with the Fifth Army in a pincer movement that could crush the German defenses once and for all. As January 1944 dawned, what had begun as a limited operation snowballed into a massive offensive. The invasion force was tremendous. The US 3rd Infantry Division, veterans of harsh campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, the British 1st Infantry Division, seasoned fighters from the deserts of Egypt, and a host of elite units including Rangers, airborne troops and commandos. As the hour of reckoning approached, tension crackled through the Allied ranks. They knew the stakes: breakthrough at Anzio, and they could shatter the stalemate that had bogged down the Italian campaign. Fail, and they risked being trapped between the sea and the full might of the German army. With the die cast and no way back, the Allies steeled themselves for the coming storm. The incursion commenced at 2 a.m. on January 12, 1944, catching the Axis forces completely off guard. The first assault waves of Allied troops landed unimpeded on the beaches of Anzio and Nettuno, swiftly moving inland to establish defensive positions. The US 3rd Division secured the northern flank of the beachhead while the British landed in the center. Simultaneously, the newly created US Army Rangers and paratroopers conducted daring operations to seize key objectives within Anzio and Nettuno. They achieved their initial objectives without encountering significant resistance, skillfully avoiding enemy patrols and ambushes. The US 36th Engineer Combat Regiment played a crucial role by clearing mines, laying roads, and preparing the port facilities to receive landing ship tanks, LSTs, and other vessels carrying vital supplies. By the end of January 12th, more than 36,000 Allied troops and 3,200 vehicles had successfully landed at Anzio. Scattered skirmishes with Axis troops resulted in over 150 Allied casualties, while approximately 200 German soldiers were captured as prisoners of war. Although the Allies had gained a foothold on the Italian mainland, they faced a determined enemy. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, managed to penetrate the Allied fighter umbrella and strafe some ships, causing minimal casualties and damage. However, instead of seizing the initiative and pushing forward while the German units were deployed along the Garigliano River to counter the advance of the US Fifth Army, the Allied commander, Major General John P. Lucas, decided to adopt a cautious approach and consolidate his forces within the beachhead, waiting for the enemy to come to him. As Lucas stood upon the Anzio beachhead, the weight of responsibility for his 69,000 men pressed heavily upon his shoulders. The mission before him was daunting: to advance inland and seize the vital town of Cisterna. However, the Germans were not idle and had managed to assemble a significant force of 71,500 troops to oppose them. The Allies had lost the element of surprise due to delays in their preparations, giving the Germans ample time to bolster their defenses. Lucas's plan was audacious. He intended to launch a double-edged strike, sending the British 1st Infantry Division as the primary attacking force towards Campolini and the Alban Hills. Simultaneously, a US Ranger force would execute a daring night raid on Cisterna, clearing the Conca Isola Bella Cisterna road in preparation for a major assault by the 15th Infantry Regiment and the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment the following day. Their objective was to swiftly capture Cisterna, a strategic town that would serve as a vital stepping stone for their further advance into Italy. The operation was fraught with risks, and its success hinged on precise execution, flawless coordination, and a healthy dose of luck. As Lucas gave the order to commence the attack, he knew that the fate of the Anzio campaign and the lives of his men rested on the outcome of this decisive battle. Nevertheless, the plan was flawed from its inception, as it relied on faulty intelligence that concluded that the primary line of German resistance was behind Cisterna. In reality, the German military had designated Cisterna as a significant staging ground for its reserve divisions and had recently moved additional forces into the area. The Germans had anticipated that the Allies might try to launch an amphibious attack in northern Italy, and although they didn't know the exact locations of the landings, they were prepared to move fast once it happened. When the German High Command learned of the Allied attack at Anzio, they swiftly deployed the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by armoured trucks and half-tracks, armed with MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns. Soon after, the Hermann Göring Division arrived at Cisterna with tanks, and the 2nd Parachute Lehr Battalion from the 4th Fallschirmjäger Division also joined the preparations for a counterattack. The Führer also ordered the redeployment of troops stationed in France, Yugoslavia, and Germany to reinforce the 3rd Panzer Grenadier and 71st Infantry Divisions to strengthen the encirclement of Anzio. Soon, General Eberhard von Mackensen's army numbered 70,000 men. The Rangers, who were supposed to be a special operations force, were not in their best condition. They had been armed for stealth and mobility with powerful weapons such as the American bazooka, but had been used as frontline soldiers for months, and their training as special operation troops had been disregarded. Moreover, they had suffered significant losses, and the reinforcements lacked specialized training. Despite the apparent risks, Lucas moved on with his plan. Just as the 2 primary forces were deployed, a Polish soldier who had just deserted the German army warned the US officers of a significant buildup of German forces at Cisterna. However, suspicion and a lack of effective communication led to the decision to proceed as planned. The Allies were unknowingly walking into a devastating trap. The German forces at Cisterna were far more numerous and better equipped than the Rangers, and they were determined to stop the Allied advance in its tracks. The Rangers were about to face one of the most challenging battles of their lives. On the dark night of January 30th, Brigadier Colonel Orlando Darby led the Ranger 1st and 3rd Battalions into battle against Cisterna, a fortress town in the heart of enemy territory. The terrain surrounding the town was vast and unforgiving, a flat expanse that offered little cover for the advancing soldiers. Undeterred, the Rangers relied on irrigation ditches to conceal their movements, creeping ever closer to their objective under the veil of darkness. Their advance was swift and silent, the Rangers expertly navigating the treacherous landscape without encountering enemy resistance. However, unbeknownst to the Allies, their movements had been detected by the vigilant German forces, who allowed them to pass in a calculated strategy to lure them into a trap. As the Rangers drew nearer to Cisterna, a storm of bullets erupted from the German defenses. The Americans were caught off guard, suffering heavy casualties in an instant. Confident in their intelligence, the 1st Battalion pressed forward, unaware that they were walking deeper into the snare that had been set for them. Chaos erupted as communication between the battalions was disrupted, leaving the 1st and 3rd Battalions unaware of each other's dire predicament. The men desperately tried to contact Colonel Darby via radio, but their efforts were futile. With no orders to retreat, they continued their assault, unaware of the German tanks that were closing in on their position. Seeking refuge in nearby irrigation ditches, the Rangers used their bazookas to destroy several enemy tanks, but their resistance only seemed to fuel the German aggression. Panzer units encircled the beleaguered battalions, cutting off all escape routes. The arrival of the German 2nd Parachute Lehr Battalion sealed the Rangers' fate. Surrounded and outnumbered, the 1st and 3rd Battalions found themselves trapped in a relentless crossfire. In a desperate attempt to alleviate the pressure, the 83rd Chemical Mortar Battalion was called in to keep the Germans at bay, but their efforts could only provide temporary relief. Reinforcements arrived to support the Rangers, but their assistance could only reach the 4th Ranger Battalion, which was positioned farthest from Cisterna and had yet to be completely encircled. With the help of B Company, the 4th Ranger Battalion managed to withdraw, leaving their fellow Rangers trapped in the outskirts of Cisterna. As dawn broke, the 1st and 3rd Battalions faced insurmountable odds. Ammunition was dwindling, communication was severed, and they were surrounded by an unrelenting enemy. Their situation seemed hopeless. Despite their valor and determination, they were forced to surrender, their valiant efforts ultimately thwarted by the cunning German trap. As more Rangers were captured and neutralized, the Germans resorted to parading the prisoners in front of the men still fighting, hoping to break their spirit and force a surrender. But in an act of sheer defiance, the Rangers sniped the prisoners' guards, prompting the Germans to brutally bayonet their comrades right before their eyes. Panic gripped the newer Rangers, many of whom abandoned their posts and surrendered to the relentless Germans. When Darby finally grasped the dire situation, he led the remnants of the 4th Ranger Battalion in desperate attempts to break the encirclement and rescue the trapped men. Yet his forces were too small, their armament too light to stand against the Wehrmacht's tanks and armored trucks. Darby's efforts to dislodge his besieged troops at Cisterna were fearless. While Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the commander of German forces in Italy, prepared a counterattack, the Allied troops cautiously advanced a few miles to further secure the beachhead. By the end of January 31st, the Germans had neutralized the last defiant pockets of Rangers. In one brutal stroke, the Wehrmacht had eradicated half of the American Ranger forces in World War II. The catastrophic defeat at Cisterna was a humiliating blow to the Allies in Italy. German morale soared, and they soon launched a massive counteroffensive on the Anzio beachhead, plunging the region into a grueling, months-long stalemate. The remaining Rangers were replaced and sent home on February 16, 1944, while the survivors in Italy were disbanded and absorbed into other units, marking a bitter end to what was intended to be an elite US force trained by British commandos. The dream of breaking the Gustav Line was a grueling ordeal that took months to materialize. The landings at Anzio and the attack on Cisterna failed disastrously, with hopes dashed and casualties mounting. By late May 1944, the US 36th Infantry Division landed at Anzio, swelling the Allied forces to a formidable 90,000 personnel, split into 7 entire divisions, ready to execute Operation Diadem. Despite their numbers, the Allies faced relentless German artillery and air attacks. Anzio Annie, a fearsome 280mm railway gun, terrorized them from the Alban Hills, turning the beachhead into a hellscape of trenches and craters. Operation Diadem's keystone was a massive artillery bombardment designed to pulverize German defenses and pave the way for an infantry advance. The Allies unleashed a torrent of firepower, aiming to create opportunities for their troops. The French Expeditionary Corps made notable progress through the rugged Aurunci Mountains, where German fortifications were weaker. On May 18th, after days of ferocious combat, the Polish II Corps captured Monte Cassino, a crucial stronghold on the Gustav Line. This victory was a turning point, shattering the German defensive position and opening a path for the Allies through the Liri Valley. The Gustav Line was finally breached. Simultaneously, the forces at Anzio, which had been stalemated since the initial landings, launched a breakout operation on May 23rd. The US 6th Corps, led by General Lucien Truscott, attacked and linked up with the advancing 5th Army, forming a potent force that overwhelmed the remaining German defenses. By the end of May 1944, the Gustav Line had been decisively broken and German forces were in full retreat. The Allies pursued relentlessly, advancing towards Rome. On June 4, 1944, they liberated the city, a victory achieved through meticulous planning, combined arms operations, and the unwavering determination of Allied soldiers. This triumph paved the way for the continued Allied advance through Italy, significantly contributing to the overall success of the campaign. One day before the Normandy invasion on June 5, 1944, Allied forces captured Rome. The brutal campaign at Anzio had cost the US over 24,000 casualties and the British nearly 10,000. An additional 37,000 were non-combat casualties due to malaria and other diseases. The Wehrmacht suffered 27,500 casualties. Tactically, Anzio was a costly failure. The element of surprise had not been enough to break the Gustav Line without substantial reinforcements. Nevertheless, the campaign forced Germany to lock down over 130,000 men in the Italian peninsula, troops that could have been critical on other fronts, especially the Eastern Front. This diversion of resources contributed significantly to Germany's eventual defeat.